Hello, amazing entrepreneur. It's Tash Corbin here, and welcome to another episode of the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. This is episode number 276, which means you can find all the relevant links and show notes over at tashcorbin.com/276. In today's episode of the podcast, I'm answering a really great question, and that is, how often should you do webinars for lead generation in your business? So, if you're interested in the answer to this one, make sure you stay tuned. Let's dive in. I'm Tash Corbin, and this is the Heart-Centered Business Podcast. Today's question comes from the amazing Kerry Miller at Kerry Miller Feng Shui. You can find her on Instagram at Kerry Miller Feng Shui. We'll make sure that we link to Kerry's website and her Instagram over in the show notes of today's episode at tashcorbin.com/276. And Kerry asked a really amazing question. She said, Tash, if you're using webinars for lead generation, how often do you recommend offering a webinar? And should it always be the same topic, or is it better to rotate topics? For example, I'm thinking of a general feng shui for success and some prosperity webinar, or I could also get more detailed and talk about what to do in your office or your front door or your bedroom for success and prosperity. Is general overview better than more focus? Thank you. Now, there's actually a bunch of different layers to this question, Kerry, and I want to say a big thank you for asking this question, because in the detail of how you've asked it, there's another part of that I really want to get a bit ranty about, and that is building webinars to do their job. So first and foremost, let's talk about what is the job of a webinar, especially when you're talking about selling your feng shui services. So the job of a webinar is to bring in qualified leads, move them through a process so that they are moving forward and actually taking some action and getting some result. And then also for the right people, helping them to see that the best next step is to invest in the product or service you're selling at the end of the webinar. So all webinars should be built to sell something specific. So even in the way that you've asked the question, I'm not 100% sure that you're clear on the job of the webinar is actually to make sales. It's not just to introduce people to your work. It's not just to give people a taste of your work. Yes, that is something you can do in a webinar, but we want to make sure your webinar is built to do its job, and that is to attract and convert qualified leads. That is the job of the webinar. The way that we do that is by helping them understand a concept, move forward in their journey, and then presenting to them an offer that would be the next logical step if they were the right fit to work with you. But the job is to attract and convert people into paying clients. So I just want to make that clear first and foremost. The second thing I want to talk about is how often to do that webinar. And I would actually recommend, especially if you are hungry for VIP one-to-one clients and you have the capacity, doing a webinar at least once a month. And in the Takeoff program and also in some of the VIP work that I do, I talk about sequencing your business so that you are doing your webinar around the same time of the month. And if you are someone who menstruates and ovulates, I would recommend in your ovulation phase, by the way, but actually setting up your business in a cycle so that it's really easy for you to rinse and repeat every single month. So for example, if you want to run your webinar in the middle of every month, then the first 2 weeks of every month, you're promoting your webinar and your VIP product or service. And then in the middle of the month, you run your webinar, and on that webinar, you would have something that you're offering. And so after the webinar, for the week after the webinar, you would be promoting that offering, right? So the same thing that you offered on your webinar, you'd be offering that publicly to your audience. And then in the final week of the month, you could focus on something more generic or growing your business in an area where you want to. So for example, if you really want to get more Instagram followers, you'd focus really on recruiting people to your Instagram for that final week of the month. So you can see that it creates this beautiful cycle and you can get into an amazing rhythm in your business. Now, with that all being said, do you run the same webinar or do you run a different webinar? That completely depends on, did the webinar work or not? So I would recommend trying with just one webinar to start with. And if it works, run it again. And if it works again, run it again. Now, what some people might find if they go through that process is that the gap between the webinars is not enough time to grow their audience with fresh people. So over time, their registrations for that webinar does drop off. In that instance, and only in that instance, I would recommend then cycling through 2 different webinars. So every second month, the webinar topic is slightly different. But you still need to take responsibility for growing your audience with enough fresh leads in between webinars that you are starting to have fresh people come into your audience so that you can maintain those webinar enrollment rates. So hopefully that answers your question, Kerry. And I would also love to just point you to a previous podcast episode called How to Make Sure Your Webinars Convert, something along those lines. I'll make sure that I link up to it in the show notes today at tashcorbin.com/276. So just head on over there and you will have a link to that previous podcast episode. Because the other thing that I would be very much focused on is building the webinar so that it does those jobs, rather than trying to decide what your webinar topic should be based on, do I go broad and shallow or do I go narrow and deep? Which is generally the question people ask me, and ultimately my answer is neither. The way that you build a webinar to do its job is by understanding that sequence and the turn process, which I explain in the other podcast episode, so I won't dive into it here. So, in summary, how often should you run a webinar, especially if you're in startup? I would recommend running one every single month. If I was starting my business over from scratch today, I would run a webinar every single month. That is how I would grow my business. And if you are wondering whether to run the same webinar over and over again or switch it up, run the same webinar consistently and see if you can continue the growth of the people who are signing up for that webinar. If it starts to fall down, your audience growth is not enough to sustain the same webinar topic every single month, then you can switch it up every second month, but do it with a focus on also growing your audience consistently, because you're still going to need to maintain that audience growth. Thank you so much for your question, Kerry. If you've been listening along and you're curious about how you could use feng shui to grow your business, make sure you go and check out Kerry's links in the show notes of today's episode. And if you've got a question that you'd like me to answer here on the podcast, make sure you go to tashcorbin.com/question and you can submit your question there. Until next time, I cannot wait to see you shine. Big love from me. And bye for now. Would you like more tips, tools, and resources to help you grow your heart-centered business? Head to tashcorbin.com today.